Boise.
Sorry.
The first time I consciously struggled with... Hello? Okay, just making sure. So we'll start this over. The first time that I consciously struggled with my Asian American identity was in 5th grade when I was writing short stories. I did what every beginner writer is told to do. Start with what you know. So I wrote from the perspective of characters who were exactly like me. But after a while, I ran into a problem. While I wanted my characters to also be Chinese American, I didn't know how to write about their ethnic identity without making the entire story about... Hello? Thank you. I didn't know how to write about their ethnic identity without making the entire story about their ethnic identity. I realized that all of the stories that I had read about Asian American characters were ones that specifically focused on their race. They were stories about immigration and learning English and tiger moms. And I didn't know how to write a story that would let an Asian American character just exist. And I began to notice this problem in other areas as well. There's a reason that TV shows and movies only feature one Asian American character, if they do at all. It's like Aziz Ansari said in season 1 of Master of None. If there's 2 Indian characters, it becomes an Indian show. But if there's 2 white characters, it's still a show for everyone. Asian American characters are never neutral because we are tainted by our foreignness. Now, one show that manages to break this barrier is the ABC series Fresh Off the Boat. So what I really love about this show is that on one hand it markets itself as a comedy about Asian American struggles, and it does focus a lot on that, but it also focuses on the everyday lives of a unique Asian family. It doesn't try to make the main character, Eddie, as the typical Asian boy because there is no typical Asian boy. Not every Asian boy loves hip-hop or lives in Orlando, but Eddie does. And similarly, I too have an identity outside of this typical immigrant experience. Every Asian American person does. Yet, our identities are still boxed into what society expects of us. For instance, after I spoke at TEDx Boise last year, a classmate criticized me for being disingenuous. His reasoning was that, on one hand, I said that I didn't like Asian stereotypes, but on the other hand, I was a stats major at Columbia. And I was actually really surprised by this, and I realized that this is precisely the problem with society's representation of Asian Americans. If I like stats, it's because I'm conforming to Asian stereotypes, but if I don't like stats, it's because I'm rejecting them. Every part of my identity is scrutinized in relation to white people's perception of me, when in reality, my college major is by no means a social statement. It's just my college major. So at this point, the question people ask is, why even stand up here and deliver this speech, or at least try to, since the mic clearly wasn't working, but why even stand up here and talk about Asian American issues when race shouldn't be the sole representation of an individual? And of course, in my ideal world, race wouldn't be an issue. I would see someone, notice that their skin is a different color, and not think much else about it. But that's not the world we live in. I'm standing up here today because racism still exists, and not just in these small rural towns of middle America, but in cities like Boston and Washington, D.C. and New York City. Maybe we're a little more subtle about it, maybe we're a little bit more politically correct, but it still exists. And without a conscious effort to interact with those who are different from us, we have wasted all of the advantages that a diverse environment can bring. When I look around at my own college campus, it is certainly more diverse than my high school in Idaho, but it is also far more segregated. In the spaces that are overwhelmingly white, I still experience some of the same ignorance that I experienced in rural America. White people still, in all seriousness, compare me to the one other Asian person that they know. They still scrutinize every aspect of my identity in relation to the Asian stereotypes that they expect me to conform to. And despite these issues, Asian Americans are still often ignored when it comes to discussions about race. I find that too often people try to use a black and white approach to race that leaves Asian Americans lost somewhere in the middle. Now, don't get me wrong, anti-blackness and white supremacy are very real, very urgent issues. But I do not believe that the Asian American identity can be derived by simply averaging the two. After all, we do play a unique role in race relations. We are the model minority. Society uses our success to pit us against other people of color as justification that racism doesn't exist. But what does this mean for us Asian Americans? It means that we aren't quite similar enough to be accepted, but we also aren't quite different enough to be loathed. We are in a perpetually gray zone and society isn't quite sure what to do with us. So they group us by the color of our skin. They tell us that we must reject our own heritages so we can fit in with the crowd. They tell us that our foreignness is the only identifying characteristic of us. They strip away our identities one by one until we are foreign but not quite foreign, American but not quite American, and individual only when there are no other people from our native country around. After all, what does it even mean to be Asian American? In Jay Kung's article for the New York Times Magazine titled "What a Fraternity Hazing Death Revealed About the Painful Search for an Asian American Identity," he too struggles with this question. He says, Asian American is a mostly meaningless term. Nobody grows up speaking Asian American. Nobody sits down to Asian American food with their Asian American parents. Nobody goes on pilgrimages back to their motherland of Asia America. Like Jay said, what binds us together is not our culture, it's discrimination. We might not all be from the same place, but many of us have been told that we don't belong here. We might not come from the same place, but many of us have been told to go back to where we came from. We might not come from the same place, but many of us watched when the Trump administration used us as their excuse for cutting back affirmative action policies. And as we watched, many of us knew that that was never about us. As women, we are stereotyped as Oriental, we are fetishized as submissive, and as men, we are constantly told that we're undesirable. We come from different backgrounds, different countries, but again, what binds us together is not our culture, it's discrimination. So, as I stand up here and tell you my story, you have no obligation to find it relatable. You have no obligation to even empathize. After all, not all of you are Chinese American, and certainly not all of you have lived in the same states that I lived. But all I ask is that for the next couple of minutes, you take the time to listen. I was born in Nanjing, China, but I moved to College Station, Texas when I was almost 3 years old. Mandarin is technically the language that I learned first, but English is by far the language that I speak best. I don't remember much about Texas. I just know that it was always really hot and I was always sweaty. When I was 5 years old, my family and I moved to Fargo, North Dakota. It was there that I learned to say bag as bag and soda as pop. It was also there that I remember seeing snow for the first time. Now, Fargo basically only has 2 seasons, summer and winter, and my favorite was always winter. So when I was 11 years old, my family and I moved all the way from Fargo, North Dakota to Sioux Falls, South Dakota. Now, Sioux Falls was only about 8 degrees warmer than Fargo, but after living in North Dakota for 6 years, it felt like Hawaii to me. And it was there that I also learned that I was bad at a lot of the things that my mom wanted me to be good at, including but not limited to math, counts, piano, and chemistry. So when I was 15, my family and I moved to our last and final destination, Boise, Idaho. I think that Boise is a really beautiful place, but I always knew that it wasn't for me. All of my classmates had grown up with each other, so I always felt like the odd one out. So after having lived in some of the most random states of America, I moved to none other than New York City, and that brings me to today. About 2 weeks ago, Haley Chung sent me an email asking me to be the speaker at this event in Boston University, and I scrolled through the email and there were 3 names that really stood out. Kedrumba, Blagalagis, and Aquafina, so obviously I knew I had to say yes. As I stand up here and tell you my story, I hope that all of you will have the opportunity to do the same. As Asian Americans, we are often represented as nerds, foreigners, and sidekicks for comedic relief. Our representation is often one-dimensional. We are not allowed the nuance, the varied perspectives, because supposedly we're all the same.